There once lived an ancient king. He was a peaceful man and did not like war. He had an amazing drum, the property of which, when it was beaten, was always to provide plenty of good food and drinks. When any country declared war against him, he would invite his enemies together and beat his drum. Then, to the surprise of everyone, instead of fighting, the people found tables spread with all sorts of dishes. That way, he kept the country quiet and sent his enemies away with full stomachs and in a happy and contented frame of mind. But there was a drawback to any man possessing the drum, and that was if he stepped over a stick or walked over a fallen tree, all the food will go bad, and 300 demons will appear and whip the owner of the drum and all the invited guests who took part in the meal. The king was a wealthy man. He had numerous farmlands, hundreds of slaves. He had 50 wives and many children. The wives were all fine women and healthy. They were also good mothers, and all of them had plenty of children, which was good for the king's house. Every few months, the king issued a feast to all his subjects. They would celebrate, dance, and eat heartily. Everyone was envious of the king's drum, but the king would not part with it. One morning, one of the king's wives took her little daughter to the spring to wash. A dwarf happened to be up a palm tree just over the spring, cutting nuts for his midday meal. And while he was cutting, one of his nuts fell to the ground just in front of the child. The little girl, seeing the food in front of her, cried for it, and the mother, not knowing any better, picked it up and gave it to her daughter. The dwarf, upon seeing this, climbed down the tree. "Where is my palm nut?" he asked. "I have given it to my child to eat," the king's wife replied. The dwarf, who very much wanted the king's drum, thought it a perfect opportunity to take advantage. So he said to the mother, "I am a poor man, and I climbed the tree to get food for myself and my family. You have taken my meal and given it upon your child. I shall tell the whole matter to the king and see what he has to say. When he hears that one of his wives has stolen a poor man's food and given it to his child, for this, as everyone knows, is a very serious crime, according to native customs." The king's wife replied, "I saw your palm nut lying on the ground, and thinking it had fallen from the tree, I gave it to my child to eat, but I did not steal it. My husband is a wealthy man," she said, "and if you have any complaint to make against me or my child, I will take you before him." And when she had finished washing her daughter, she took the dwarf to the king and told him what had happened. The king then asked the dwarf what he will accept as compensation for the loss of his palm nut. "What will you take?" the king asked. "You may have anything you like." The dwarf immediately pointed to the king's drum and said it was the only thing he wanted. In order to get rid of the dwarf, the king said, "Very well, take the drum." But he never told him of the bad omen which may befall him if he walked over a fallen tree or stepped over a stick on the road. The dwarf rejoiced. He was very glad and carried his drum home in triumph to his wife and said, "I am now a rich man, and I do not have to walk. Whenever I want food, all I have to do is beat this drum, and food will immediately be brought to me, and plenty to drink." His wife and children were very pleased when they heard this and asked the dwarf to get food at once, as they were all hungry. This the dwarf was only too pleased to do, as he wished to show off his newly acquired wealth and was also rather hungry himself. So he beat the drum in the same manner in which he saw the king do, and immediately there was plenty to eat. So they all sat down and made a great feast. The dwarf did this for weeks, and everything went well. His children were no longer looking skinny, but very healthy and well taken care of. He was very proud, to the point where he wanted to display his riches. He sent invitations to the king, and all the people in the land to come and feast with him. Upon receiving the dwarf's invitation, the people laughed, as they knew the dwarf was very poor, so very few attended. So the dwarf beat his drum, and all kinds of meals were being served. The guests had a seat and enjoyed their meal. They were very much astonished that a poor dwarf would be able to entertain so many people. News was spread around town of the dwarf's expensive feast. After the feast, all people looked upon the dwarf as one of the richest men in the kingdom. He was very much respected. As a result, no one, except the king, could understand how the poor dwarf could suddenly entertain so lavishly. But at this point, they have made up their minds that if the dwarf was to have another feast, they would definitely be in attendance. When the dwarf had been in possession of the drums for a few months, he became lazy and did no work. He went about town, boasting of his riches, and took to too much drinking. One day, after having a lot of wine from a distant farm, he started home, carrying his drum. Having had too much to drink, he did not notice a stake in the pot, so he walked over it, and immediately the spell was broken. But he took no notice of this, as nothing had happened at the time. He arrived home tired, and threw the drum into a corner and went to sleep. When he awoke the next day, he was hungry, and his wife and children were calling out for food. And so he beat his drum, but instead of food, his house was surrounded by demons who beat the dwarf, his wife, and children very badly. At this, the dwarf became very angry and said to himself, "I asked everyone to a feast, but only a few came. They had plenty to eat and drink. Now when I want food for myself and my family, the demons beat me. I shall let everyone share the same fate, as I do not see why I and my family should be beaten when I have given a feast to all," he said. And so he sent out an invitation to everyone in the kingdom. And when the time arrived, many people came, as they did not wish to lose the chance of a free meal for the second time. The sick, the lame, the blind, everyone. When they had all arrived, with the exception of the king and his wives, who sent excuses, the dwarf then beat his drum as usual and quickly hid himself. His wife and children had been sent away from the feast, as he knew what was to come. While the guests eagerly awaited their meals, instead of receiving a plate of delicacy, they were served with whiplashes from every angle. They could not escape, as the doors were already fastened. The beating went on for hours. The guests were badly punished, as some of them were being carried home by their friends. The people were so angry that they rendered curses upon the dwarf. He made up his mind to return the drum to the king the next day. At the break of dawn, he went to the king with the drum. "I am not satisfied with your drum," he said, "and I wish to exchange it for something else." The king, however, refused, but as he felt sorry for the dwarf, he said he would present him with a magic tree, which would provide enough food for him and his family, provided he kept certain terms and conditions. This the dwarf gladly consented to. The tree only bore fruit once a year, but it dropped a meal every day. The condition was that the owner should gather sufficient food for that day once and not return again. The dwarf thanked the king for his generosity. He went home to his wife and told her about the tree. And so they gathered enough food for the day and left home happily. They all enjoyed themselves that night, but one of the sons, who was very greedy, thought to himself, "I wonder where my father gets all this food from," he asked. The next morning, he asked his father, "Tell me, where do you get this food from?" But his father refused to answer, and his wife, who was a cunning woman, said, "If we let our children know the secrets of the tree, someday, when they are hungry, after we have had our daily supply, one of them may go to the tree and gather more, which will break the spell forever." But the envious son, being determined, decided to track his father. And so the next day, when his father went to get the daily supply, he followed, taking care to hide himself and not to let his father perceive that he was being followed. At last, the dwarf arrived at the tree, so he placed his bow to collect the daily supply for the day. After which, the dwarf returned home. The boy followed, but said nothing. The next morning, he called some of his brothers, after his father had finished getting the daily supply for the day, and so they went to the tree and collected more, and so the spell was broken. At the break of dawn the next day, the dwarf went to the tree, but he found nothing there. He called all his family together and told them what had happened, and asked them who had done this evil thing. They all denied having had anything to do with the tree, and so the dwarf in despair brought all his family to the place where the tree was, but which was now all prickly palms. "My dear wife and children," he said, "I have done all that I can do for you, but you have broken my spell. You must therefore fend for yourself for the future.